I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, will we still read books in 20 years? We ask Ethan Mollick and Steven Johnson. I love books. I love the smell of them, the feel of them, the ridiculous jackets that fall off and crumple by the spine and tatter at the edges, the whole experience. And I truly believe that to read a book, especially in this moment in history, is a radical act of listening, of focus, of meditation for 6, 8, 10, 12 hours at a time. I spent my 20s as a book editor, and I've come back to it. I've spent the last 6 years building a business at the Next Big Idea Club that's all about celebrating the ideas in books. I feel about books the way foodies feel about truffles, the way toddlers feel about bubble wrap. But 2 of my 3 boys, they have no use for books. They really don't see the point. They think video, YouTube, is a better format for communicating ideas. And these kids are really curious and engaged with the world. And let's keep this between us, but they're probably better informed than I am on a lot of topics. So I find myself wondering, in the great stretch of human history, will the book as we know it today prove to be historically specific? There was a time, of course, before the book, a time that Socrates considered to be a better time. This invention, said Socrates, will produce forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn to use it because they will not practice their memory. We know this, of course, because his student Plato wrote it down. The AI revolution is beginning to change how many people are writing books today. AIs are becoming extensions of our minds, as books were before them. If the computer is a bicycle for the mind, as Steve Jobs put it, AI is a motorcycle. Where is our mind meld with AI headed? How will we write in future years? And how will we read? I can't think of any 2 individuals I would rather discuss this with than Steven Johnson, the celebrated writer and editorial director at Google Labs and Notebook LM, and Ethan Mollick, the Wharton professor who's emerged in the last year as perhaps the leading voice on how AI is changing the way we work. By the way, this conversation took place over Zoom with members of our new community and learning platform for writers called Author Insider. If you are a writer, you should definitely give it a look. Just search for Author Insider on Substack. And if you decide to subscribe, there's a special discount that you can activate by following the link in the episode notes. I would add that if you've even thought about writing a book in the future or starting a Substack or podcast, I think you'll find some really amazing resources and community discussions at Author Insider. Again, just search for Author Insider on Substack. All right, after the break, our conversation with Ethan and Steven. Well, first of all, welcome everybody. It's great to see everyone. We're in store for a fascinating conversation today about the future of the book in the age of AI. We couldn't have 2 better guests for this conversation than Steven Johnson and Ethan Mollick. Kurt Vonnegut is reported to have said, to flatter a person, it's more effective to praise their minor secret vanities than their major accomplishments. So I'm going to see if I can do both right now. You all probably know that Steven Johnson is the author of at least a dozen books about science, technology, the history of ideas, from emergence and ghost map to where good ideas come from, and recently The Infernal Machine. You may also know that he's the editorial director of Notebook LM and Google Labs at the white-hot center of writing and artificial intelligence. You may not know that he's been obsessed with tools for thinking ever since he first downloaded HyperCard on his Macintosh SE in 1987. And he may have prompted Notebook LM more than anyone else on the planet. Ethan Mollick, you probably know as the Wharton professor who's become one of the leading thinkers on the topic of how AI is transforming knowledge work, business, and education. You may be familiar with his popular Substack, One Useful Thing, and his influential book, Co-Intelligence. You may not know that Ethan is an avid game designer, that he worked at DARPA on game-based training. He's designed board games and co-founded Wharton Interactive, which developed alternate reality simulation games used by, I think, tens of thousands of MBA students around the world. All right, let me start with a really simple question with an answer that's a number. How much faster do you two think that you can write a book today than you could have 5 years ago? Twice as fast? 5 times as fast? 10 times as fast? We'll get into the mechanics of all this, of course, in the conversation, but I'm curious just to start with a number. What do you think, Stephen?
Including the research process, I'm assuming. So from idea to final project, at least twice as fast.
And Ethan, what do you think?
Hopefully my editor is not on this as I work on my next book, but I would say 3 to 4 times. With academic article, I just finished a revision that took 90% less time than they usually do, and the paper got accepted. So that's a good stat, I guess.
Wow. Astounding. Well, let's start by talking about how AI is changing the way we write books today, starting with how you all are changing how you're writing books, beginning with the beginning of the process, conceiving a book idea and developing it. Stephen, you've talked about a hypothetical new book about the gold rush era. I don't know if this is hypothetical or not. How do you go about exploring new ideas and testing where they might lead?
Yeah, I mean, I can take it back to pre this gold rush idea, which was about a year ago started to organize my thoughts for what would the next book be. And at that point I had, as I normally do, I'm sure Ethan, you're like this too, I had 15 different ideas that were floating around in different stages. And so for me, as someone who works and does most of his thinking inside of Notebook LM, I created a new notebook called The Next Book. And that just became the kind of grab bag of places where I would jot down an idea I had, just write it old-fashioned style as a note in that notebook. Or if I read an interesting article, I would add that article to Notebook. And slowly it would kind of accumulate over time. And one of the things that was amazing that I couldn't do before is after 3 or 4 months, I would sit down and be like, okay, summarize the top contenders for the next book. What are the ideas that are in here? And it would just be here you go. And you could just kind of go through, and in 10 seconds, you have this great overview of all the different things that I was thinking. And then I started kind of homing in on this idea of the gold rush. And a lot of it was trying to figure out, with any narrative history book like this, you're trying to figure out what can you add to the story? And so one of the first things that I did was I read this canonical account by this guy, H.W. Brands, great historian, called the Age of Gold, I think it is. And using Readwise, I brought in the quotes that I'd highlight from that book into Notebook. And Readwise has a great export to Notebook kind of feature. So you can read on the Kindle or whatever e-reader you use. You get the passages that are relevant. And I brought it into Notebook. And then I would kind of throw things against the canonical account. So I was interested in the Native American kind of experience, particularly in the Yosemite Valley. So I found a bunch of public domain articles about the Yosemite Valley. And I would kind of and the Native American experience there. And I would basically load those into Notebook, and I'd be like, what is in these sources that is not in the traditional canonical account? And it was kind of a prelude to reading those new sources, but I was able to get kind of a guidepost of what was there and what wasn't there. And your ability to just find things or find potential interesting little nuggets in all that research material is it's amazing. You just get to the insight or get to that interesting character much faster than you would traditionally do. And then last thing I'll say, and we can dive into it more, but I'm curious about how Ethan thinks about this. I had at some point this idea that came to me about the structure of the book, and which would have this very unusual structure where it would start 10 million years ago and then fast forward to 1 million years ago and then 100,000 years ago, and about the formation of the Sierras and about gold and all that stuff, and eventually get closer and closer to the events of the story. And so I kind of described that structure to Notebook, and it had all these sources by this point, had lots of my notes in there, lots of my thinking. And so I was like, if I took all of this research and turned it into this book structure, what would go in each of those chapters? And again, it was something in 15 seconds, I had this amazing, like really nuanced description of like how the book might work with that structure. And this is the thing, Ethan writes about this a lot too, which is like, these tools are like combination generators or like possibility generators. And the ability to be like, well, what if I did it this way? You get this quick evaluation or potential like scenario for how it could work that way. And then you're like, okay, let's try it another way. What would it look like if I did it this way? And that work used to just be very labor intensive, but now you can make those imaginative leaps just a lot faster.
Interesting. Ethan, what do you think? It's tantalizing to hear you're working on a new book. Of course, we're curious. How is it different from your development process with your last book?
So I'm a very messy writer, right? So I feel I'm like watching Stephen talk and I'm like, oh, that's how a good author should do things, right? As opposed to an accidental author who sort of blog posted their way into books. But I kind of approach things a little differently, right? So when I'm doing academic research, it's a little bit different, which is, my primary kind of day job or has been. But for book writing, I actually try and reserve the early part of the process entirely for me. There's a separate research stream of, I use a mix of notebook, but I also use deep research tools and a few other things to sort of help me kind of pave the way on topics that interest me. But I always start writing on my own because I find that AIs have gotten good enough that they infect my thoughts too much. So I find I need to kind of put my own structure in place and then I go back and forth. Now, I use them to fill in gaps, right? Like I can't figure out how to, like, I know I want to talk about the transformer paper and help me come through with 35 analogies I could use for this. So the other thing I want to point out is abundance, right? When I ask for anything, I want to be curating. I don't want to just be getting an answer from the AI. So it's like, give me 70 versions of a sentence. I want more of 3. I want more of 7. 7, but less corny. That's not like me at all. What are you doing? That kind of stuff. So I have projects called Book in Claude, which I still think is the best writer of the group, and in Gemini and in OpenAI. And I use those mostly as kind of like, here's my writing and my thoughts kind of piece. But I always write first drafts on my own and then go back to the AI. Now, except for the research stream. I mean, for example, my research stream this time has been, I take all my tweets on AI because basically every paper that's come out, I've tweeted about at some point. So I take all the papers and I actually have built a RAG-based interface where I can ask questions of any of the papers. Vibe coding, I don't know how to do it myself, but with the help of an RA who had also never coded before, and we're able to, and so I actually am having conversations with the sources. Works a lot like Notebook, just a wider range, and I could kind of control how it works more. So after the fact, lots and lots of AI use. Fake being a reader, give me feedback on this. I can't make the sentence work. Help me out. The actual writing, I always start on my own.
It seems to be this question of how we collect thoughts, right, and make them available to AI to help us do more with them has become a lot more important. And Stephen, you were very fortunately or presciently started like decades ago with your Spark file, writing down ideas that were interesting to you, and also highlighting on Readwise the most interesting passages of books. Ethan, it sounds like your tweeting and blog posting has itself been a form of kind of collecting what you find to be the most interesting ideas. So that works very well for you. I wonder if this isn't something that everyone who has any interest in writing or frankly doing anything creative or productive wants to be more mindful about, is how do we go about collecting ideas now that we can do so much more with like a big messy pile of ideas than we could before.
Yeah, I remember when I first got to Google 3 years ago, there was a guy, Clay Bavor, who had started Labs, who subsequently left, but he was kind of the guy with Josh Woodward who recruited me to come. And both Clay and I and Josh, actually, we all are Readwise users, and we had a like huge collection of quotes like that I actually started before the Kindle came along. I would like transcribe quotes and stuff like that. But it was like pretty clear to me, like having searchable text quotes from books that I'd read was going to be valuable. And I was interested in the history of notebooks and commonplace books and things like that. So I had a little bit of a head start, as you said. But so I basically, when I arrived at Google, I had a collection of 8,000 quotes from books that I'd read over the last 20 years. And it was like, these are all the ideas that shaped who I am today intellectually. And so in a way, like the dream that I was kind of chasing with Notebook in the early days was like, could I get an AI that has read all of those quotes so that I could just be like, hey, I'm writing something about ant colonies, like summarize the whole thing about like pheromone communications with ants based on my reading history, and it would just generate that. And I remember the conversation I had with Clay early on where we were talking, he had even more quotes, like he had like 13,000 quotes in his collection. And And at some point, I was describing how we were going to build this amazing tool to organize all this stuff. And he's like, Stephen, the thing you need to remember is that you and I are not normal. We are weirdos. Like, people don't walk around with this many quotes. But I think actually people have a lot more of this stuff than they realize. Like, if you've been reading ebooks and highlighting passages that were interesting to you, like, you have a quote collection there. You just need to unlock it. And if you've been writing a blog over the years, like, you have a whole history of your thinking that's been in there, or if you keep a diary or whatever it is, there's a lot of like digital archives that we actually have like built for ourselves without fully realizing it. And we just didn't have tools that let us like unlock all that past history the way that AI does today.
I mean, one of the things I find myself doing is recording audio notes on my iPhone much more frequently and just copy transcript and then query AIs with it. Do you all find yourselves collecting more thoughts in more ways in order to feed the process?
So, I mean, I think we're in a really interesting little transitional state where you have to do the work collecting the stuff. I mean, I think recording is really interesting, right? Because I didn't take recording very seriously. Like, if someone says, "Can I record this conversation?" I mean, I've done enough qualitative research. I know people aren't going to read the whole, like 99.9% of the time, no one's ever going to go to that transcript. Even when you could turn the transcripts, into the recording into text, no one was going to read all of that unless they were in some sort of deposition, right? And I think the thing that has actually changed, I think has kind of profound implications beyond just books, is that information is now all mineable, right? If you record this call, I can get, tell me, the 3 secrets Stephen, Johnson had about how to do writing, and it will pull out something useful without me doing mental work. It might not be 100% correct. It'll be mostly correct. But the idea that now this vast trove of data is accessible in different ways, I think that's going to put pressure on what we do for research, right? It's one thing to have, like, I personally selected these 6 best quotes, but the other thing is read every book before 1900 on the gold rush, find the most interesting quotes in them, give me those quotes in context, and assemble them like that. We're not that far from it, right? And it fits into the wider picture, which is, until very recently, the AI labs did not care about writing quality. And that has changed very dramatically, very quickly in the last few months with some very big implications. So, I think collecting your thoughts is really, really important. But I wonder, we're in a transitional period where that ability to be a really good selector and be very widely read, if that's still going to be as useful as it was.
I wonder how good you think, Ethan, that AI is now. And as you said, it's moving very quickly. And something you often like to say is, whatever its limitations are, that's going to change. But I wonder if you find that it's as good at selecting and identifying good ideas or interestingness as it is at, you make the case for a maximalist approach of asking AI to generate 100 ideas or, large volumes, abundance. Does that suggest that you have less faith in its ability to select from among ideas, or it's just that process helps your ideation?
So we've been testing this actually, and it turns out with good prompting, you can generate a very diverse pool of ideas, more than most people. Now, not more than many of the authors here on the call, right? I mean, part of why you're on this call, if you're a published author that anyone cares about, right, or has managed to get anything published, you're in a very small percentage of people who've gotten people to pay attention to your writing, right, or who've gotten where you are by writing. And there's a big gap between top percentile and not. But I think that ideation, and Stephen knows more than me even about this, is a multi-step process, right? So you want variation, and then you want to select among variation, and you want to narrow things down and then blow things back up. And whatever part of the process you're worst at, AI is better than you, right? And often for the parts you're best at, it's a supplement, right? It's the exact same thing in ideation as like writing. I write my own first draft because the AI will overwhelm my ideas with other ideas that will then anchor me in their direction. But then when I need diversity, I can get that on demand. So I think part of this is about starting to break apart the parts of writing that were unconscious before because it was just how you did things, and starting to think about, when do I want diversity? When do I want to be doing curation? When do I want to be, going to a new discovery research mode? Because I don't necessarily have to do all my research in advance and have a pile of note cards the way I may have had to before. So it's about this process, breaking the process, and then deciding what pieces of it you want to keep, and being very conscious then about where you want to be human and where you want this AI piece in place, and what parts of that you're good at and what parts you're not good at.
Stephen, I think I remember you saying that you were surprised by how good AIs were at identifying that which was interesting.
Oh yeah.
Right? I mean, you're very good at seeing what's interesting about ant colonies. Maybe not everyone is as good at that automatically. They need help. But when you prompt it by saying, what is the most surprising fact about ant colonies and how they function, you find those to be useful prompts.
Yeah, that was one of the first things where I felt like notebook and source grounding as an approach, where you're not just talking to a general model, but you're giving it sources, which kind of notebook, you could argue, kind of pioneered in some ways, where I felt like the interestingness kind of search query was pretty magical. It was like one of the first moments when I was like, oh, this was just not possible before. It was not possible to like Command F for interestingness. So I think that's a really valuable thing. The one thing I would say actually on the whole writing thing that I'm curious what Ethan would say about this, like I trust the model to do a lot of like basic work for me. Like I need a timeline of the events here. That would be laborious to build, but it'll do it in 10 seconds. Amazing. That's fantastic. I need to brainstorm some ideas. I need to basically do advanced kind of semantic search through all this huge amounts of material to find something I'm looking for. I need to generate possibilities. What I don't do is ask it really to evaluate. I almost never like show it something that I've written and say like, hey, is this working? In part because of this sycophantic problem that it's always like, Stephen, that's brilliant. But I somehow like don't quite trust its judgment yet in this way. I trust my judgment as a writer and editor better than I do the AI. But I know there are folks who do use it that way. So that's the line that kind of I haven't crossed yet.
And I think, Ethan, this is where you use personas.
Yeah, I mean, I do. And I mean, I trust it like another person, right? Like it has persona in two ways, actually. One is I definitely ask it, pretend to be a naive reader and read through this, think about, help me find connections I couldn't find. Where would someone who is non-technical get confused? But also that the models have personas, right? So I know that I'm going to get I actually get the least sycophancy and the best feedback in my writing from the biggest Claude model of the moment, right? Tends to do a very good job. I know not that they're not extended thinking in most cases. I know the Google models are actually the worst at giving me feedback on writing. Just for a persona perspective, they're coder brained. They feel like they should be writing code. They don't like words that much. And so the models have different feels to them. If you want something really alien, you should go to, and it's not very accurate, you might want to go to Kimi, which is one of the big Chinese models, which just has a very different feel to it than the American model. So I'll often ask, when I write something, I usually ask 3 or 4 different models with 3 or 4 different ways for feedback, and I reject, again, 90% of it. But the 10% that I keep is great. And then the other thing is, sometimes I'm an academic. I'm proud of my writing. I've written, for many unaided non-AI books and lots of blog posts. But I will tell you what's happened in the last few months has been, I try, like often endings are the hardest hit. Like help me, nail the ending, help me nail the first paragraph. And I'm increasingly finding what the AI, and I probably shouldn't put this on a podcast, but what the AI suggestion, especially like a quote, it ends up being the thing that people quote most from my piece. Right. And like I've gone through and selected it, like people often really like, oh, that's such a well-written phrase. And I'm like, I wrote 99% of 1% of the words are for the AI. But like if people like it resonates with people. And part of that is learning, as I think every author does, like we're speaking to a narrow audience, and much of that audience doesn't really follow the things we would do and takes different things away from our work. And so the idea of having we all wish, we've all had great editors, I'm sure, but the idea of having a tireless editor that you can just keep bugging about something and who isn't judging you. Like my editor, who's terrific. It makes me nervous, right? Because I want to do a good job for the editor. I want them to, I want them to like my stuff. And so it's hard to know how much of that is just having more of a solid editor around versus how much of that is something special about AI. But I do think that the different tones of the different models matter. And I think if you're not just I think it's well worth paying $60 to subscribe to the big 3 pro models when you're writing, and ask them all, and you might have different favorites. It might be that for particular kinds of science writing, something else is better. And it's different, by the way, for deep research. I think right now Gemini is my favorite deep research tool for book writing because it does a really good job of creating overviews of topics. I think that if you wanted to create an argument about something, I would go to OpenAI or Claude, which I think feel much more like graduate students doing narrow work on a topic and coming with an argument. Like they're more likely to come with a unique idea you didn't, but it won't feel like your idea. Well, Google's pretty good at giving you an overview of a topic where you're like, oh, here's a whole bunch of stuff that I didn't think of. And at this point, like that's free the work, basically. I mean, $20 a month work, right? And like not using it feels strange to me at this point. Like there's a huge advantage to doing it.
And if we want a diversity of perspectives, which, and we know we think better when we have a diversity of perspectives present, that requires prompting and building persona, what you call personas, Ethan, right? Didn't you create kind of like an arrogant character to critique your work and co-intelligence, right? And do you continue to do this? Do you think this is a good strategy?
So as I've learned more about the models themselves, I do less to manipulate their perspectives. In a lot of cases, I'll sort of talk to them and say, hey, rather than saying pretend to be, I'll say, and give me some considerations from a naive user perspective and not. Because one of the things that's happened since, I wrote my book the first time is, models have gotten much, much, much better, much smarter at writing, much more able to handle huge amounts of context at a time, more able to have theory of mind. We've been doing a lot of testing on how much theory of mind, like the AI can predict not only what you think, but what your reader might think based on what you read pretty accurately, or at least reasonably. It's gotten 3 or 4 levels deep pretty well in theory of mind. So I don't find I need to do as much dancing and singing around these models. And another big message I have for anyone listening to this is we've been testing this rigorously. All the methods that we've been teaching people about how to prompt AI no longer matter very much. Chain of thought, where you tell it things step by step, no longer helps very much. We've actually proven that bribing and threatening does not help your model's accuracy. So I'm talking to it much more like a person and much less manipulation than I did where I'm like, pretend to be someone else. Instead, I'll just say, where do you think a naive reader might be tripped up on this? And I find that that's at this point, because it's gotten smart enough, I'd have to play less games to get value out of what it does.
I'm curious to know what you were describing, I think, Ethan, about having occasionally seeing these flashes of really beautiful word combinations coming out of LLMs. I mean, I think that I think you've said that hey, AIs may write better than most humans, but the top 1%, 0.1% of writers whose books we pay for write better than AIs typically. But I'm finding in my own interactions with these different models that I occasionally, more and more, I'm encountering word combinations where I think, oh, wow, that's a beautiful sequence of words. And that causes me to think we maybe have the beginnings of visibility to a place where, AIs are going to be writing the one-click Steven Johnson book or whatever that if, once you can, there's a beautiful phrase, then there's the beautiful sentence. And if you can stack 5 beautiful sentences in sequence that communicate something concisely, all of a sudden it's just exceptional writing. Do you all see that in our future, and what are the implications of that?
So something that I've come to pay a lot more attention to in recent months is something called the bitter lesson, which is this idea from computer science, which was according to 2019, so it's not like this old idea, but best explained with chess computers, right? So the early chess computers were all based on taking tons of moves and chess master knowledge and cramming it into a machine that could make good choices based on that. And even the model that eventually beat Kasparov was partially huge amounts of machine testing different ideas, but it was still built on the knowledge of chess masters. What the bitter lesson teaches us, though, is that better than any handcrafted knowledge is just building a machine that can learn the right way to do things and then putting enough computing power into it until you get a solution. And that's how, AlphaZero, which was a Google product in, I think, 2018 or 2017, learned chess and could beat any grandmaster by just playing against itself. It didn't know the rules of chess. And one of the things that started to happen really recently, and it started with PowerPoint and Excel, is that companies like OpenAI, when they build their agents that do create Excel and PowerPoint, they originally would go through these multi-step processes. I actually had a conversation when the new OpenAI agent came out with the ChatGPT team. And I was like, one of the things that's really annoying to me about this agent is every other AI agent I use gives me steps, the directions it's going to follow. I mean, Google does this with deep research. I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, and then I'll do this. And I said, it's really frustrating that it doesn't do that because I can't intervene. And like, oh no, of course it doesn't do that. We just trained it on what good PowerPoint looks like. We have no idea how it's deciding what it does. There's no plan. It just produces good PowerPoint given an input. And what they've started to do very recently is do the same thing with writing. We're not giving it the rules of writing. We're just going to say, here are the most admired pieces of writing on earth. And we have an LLM judge how good the quality of the writing is. and we're just going to keep running until the model's a really good writer. And I've seen enough of this early stage stuff to see this bears some fruit. I mean, I don't think the old school LLMs would have gotten there on their own because they have trouble building a coherent storyline over time. They could write 2 really good paragraphs, but then it starts to, they can't foreshadow well. They can't, plot well. But now I'm starting to see models that are able to both do the planning and the writing. And I think that, the walls close in a little bit. I mean, they're really good at what AI is best at, which is analogy and connections. And as somebody who writes on connections between things, and Stephen certainly does the same thing, I definitely feel it horning in on that kind of knowledge, which is like, give me the connection between the medieval guild system and the infrastructure problems in America today, and you'll get something that feels profound and interesting, and might be profound and interesting. So to me, some of this is just this general challenge to our craft of like, well, is this special, right? And I think the bitter lesson ultimately says nothing we do is special, because it can all be automated with enough computing power. And I think we're making a big bet that won't be true about writing. And I worry a little bit that we might be betting too big on that.
Stephen, you're really close to this. How do you think about it?
Well, I mean, I said before, like, I feel like on a 5-year time horizon, like, I feel very confident that this is just an enabling technology for people who write books like the books that I write, that I'll just write better books and they'll be easier to write, they'll be more fun to write, and I'll write them faster. But, I think to Ethan's point, like, is it now foreseeable that there is a potential future here where you can have the one-click Stephen Johnson book that can be just summoned for you? You kind of list a couple of topics you're interested in and you have 300 pages, like, in a way that was absolutely not imaginable like 2 years ago, 3 years ago. I think it's possible to imagine it, but my feeling is like, if that is true, like there will be so many other consequences for society that like the fate of nonfiction authors will be like a tiny little fraction of this, and we'll have to reorganize everything because that will be the sign of a truly AGI-like system. But I think one thing I think we should talk about a little bit, which is kind of, we've been dancing around the edges of it, which is like, what does it mean also for the output of the book? Like,
yes.
Yeah, we're thinking about this like, I'm using all these tools to create a linear 300-page book that you read from start to finish. And a couple of weeks ago, we just rolled out these new featured notebooks at Notebook LM, which are like curated notebooks designed to be kind of explored in lots of different ways, created with kind of some partners. None of them are actual kind of books, really, although one of them was an excerpt from Eric Topol's book. But I'm super interested in like whatever I publish this next book, whatever that next book turns out to be, like I'm super excited to publish it as a notebook, as well as an ebook, an audiobook, or whatever. And the possibilities of like reading it in a traditional way, which you can always do inside of Notebook because the sources are there, but also maybe approaching it and saying, hey, I need a 10th grade version of this. Well, the model will just generate that on the fly for you. Obviously, translating it into other languages is an incredible skill. But also taking each chapter and turning it into a video overview version of each chapter, or generating quizzes or flashcards if you're a student trying to understand it. Like there's kind of been this like interactive book thing that we've been, since HyperCard really, and since the days of like CD-ROM multimedia and stuff like that. And I feel like the thing I'm now realizing that we were missing was some kind of complex multimodal language model that could dynamically generate all these different kind of takes on the core material. And so and that maybe suggests another future version, even if the models do become really good at kind of generating the prose, that there's still a world where it's like I'm building little kind of worlds and I'm writing some of it, but I'm also just kind of curating the material and the focus and the interests with a certain sensibility that I have. And then the AI is enhancing that vision or those sets of interests in ways that match what the reader, the viewer wants out of it. And that actually becomes a commercially viable way to share ideas with the world, but it doesn't look like writing a traditional book the way that we write them now. So I think there's a lot that's going to happen in that front that hopefully we can push the boundaries of it. Notebook.
Well, and I would say, the downside risk, right, is that the number of people who tell me they've had AI summarize my book or my article or whatever it is. I mean, there is this idea of information extraction. This is a long book about the gold rush. I just want what was the point, right? And in some ways it's kind of interesting, right, to have this as be an option, but it's something that we haven't that I think is a real change, right? And that changes how reading works. And I want people to have dialogue with my book, but do I want to have it with a character involved? Do I want my book to be, but it's even more transformative. I can throw my book into, and I have done this, right, or an academic article into, Gemini or ChatGPT with a big enough context window and say, turn this into an interactive game, right? And then I can, or actually build a product based on this, build an ideation system based on Stephen Johnson's ideas and, code it up and run it. So the transformation is beyond just the conversational transformation makes me nervous. People are just sort of extracting out all of the essence of the book. But whatever reading is reading, and it's not like college students haven't done that before. But then transformation is bigger transformation than I just want to talk to the book, right? It's the book do something for me, which is a weird place to be. Like, what should the book do for you? And that's for fiction too. Like, I want to be in this book and make something happen. We are very close to that in a lot of different ways. I want to visualize this, and I don't know how we deal with that kind of transformation, right? What the right pieces are. When I launched my book, and this was a year and a few months ago, I had GPTs for each chapter that I put out. There was like, if you want to test your idea on these scenarios, use this, and prompts and stuff. But like, I think that feels primitive now compared to what you can do.
I have to think this will apply differently to different types of book, different genres of books. I mean, I think what we're talking about is selling the whole corpus of all the research that went into the book, right, as part of it. And one can imagine that authors are selling corpuses and readers are getting the version of the book that they would most engage with.
I've always felt that we may look back on categories like advice books and say, actually, 300-page books were the wrong format for that all along. It was just the only option we had. And a conversational AI notebook style experience where the expertise is all captured there, but you interact with it by asking questions based on your personal situation. Like, that's actually a better format for that. We just didn't have that option before. Maybe people will disagree with that, but like, if there's a marketplace for that and you can sell your expertise in that format alongside the other formats, I feel like that's probably fine. I assume there's a world where like narrative, like if you write historical stories, if you write fiction, that there's something fundamentally unsatisfying about like, hey, I don't want to read this whole story. Just tell me like the 5 most interesting moments in the story. Like that, it feels intuitively like that will not be a substitute for what we get out of narrative, and that thus people who write kind of linear sequences will have some moat, I guess is the word, that AI will like not get around. It may well be like, I'd like to watch this as a documentary and experience a story that way, and can the AI generate a documentary? But I think we would still have that desire to hear the whole sequence in order when anything is in narrative form.
There is a little bit of this, which is referring back to Stephen, which is like, if this stuff gets good enough at writing, then there's a lot of other bad and good, and all kinds of things are going to happen at once. And that's kind of where we're heading, right? In some ways, which is like, it is kind of funny to be like, will they take our books and turn them into, will our books, linear narrative still make sense? I mean, this is a new tool for writing. If we just take it in isolation as a tool for writing, I think there's transformation heading our way, right? All the ways, like for good and for bad, right? But this is going to be another, and I'm glad to see people on this call who are authors, because I think that I worry that the sort of arts and letters community is sitting this one out in a way where they should, like, part of this is about worries about plagiarism. Part of this is about discomfort with the technology companies involved in this. I mean, there's lots of good reasons too. I mean, some like environment are less of a big deal at the individual level, but big at societal levels. But like, I get it. But I really see, and this is something I see online a lot, and when I talk to fellow academics, a lot of people sitting this out. And this is the moment where you actually want to see early 1900s modernist explorations of like, what does it mean to write a book now that we can write different ways? How do we start rethinking how books work? What do we like? I want to see authors experimenting with this. I don't want the labs to do it. No offense, Stephen, to like Notebook LM, which I think is great, but like, I don't think that they don't care that much about writing, right? They've read the same 12 science fiction novels that I can name to you, and some of them are quite good. But like, I really do think this is a moment to step in and start to try and shape what this could look like. And then to return to the other thread of like that Steve was mentioning earlier, I do think we're heading to a world where things do transform quite greatly. I mean, there is a feeling that stuff is going to happen, probably slower than the AI labs think. But I think when you say slower, you mean in the next 5 years, the world won't be that altered, right? It's not like, as opposed to 2 years from now, we'll all be machine, But I do think that there is a lot of change happening. And I think words and writing are what these machines are built best to do.
Mhm.
Humanities people are often the best people to use them. Historians, people can like and it's so funny because I talk to historians all the time, for example, who are absolutely in love with these things can do, but can't talk to their colleagues about it because they absolutely just they can't admit that they're using LLMs to do work. And so I think that part of this is about seizing some of that control back in some ways as well.
One thing that's occurred to me is we had a conversation on the show with Saul Khan, who started Khan Academy. And one of his comments when talking about how AI will affect education was this whole idea that a piece of writing is an artifact, a direct artifact of somebody's brain or a direct reflection of how somebody thinks, we need to get over, right? That we're moving towards an era where, of course, a large portion of writing will be AI mediated or enabled in some fashion. And maybe in the school system, this moves us towards more Socratic dialogue, more oral exams, more maybe actually doing what we're doing right now, having direct conversations and communicating with each other. It strikes me that one possible outcome is AI gets so good at writing that at some inflection point, we start to value more the conversation as where human minds connect.
I mean, I think it's a hard thing to know, right? Like, I think that a lot of people are making a lot of predictions, and like we don't have any idea. And my advice I tend to give is one about agency, which is we get to shape it. Like, I'm surprised at how much people listen to me, and part of it is like I experiment in public about a lot of this stuff and try and show what happens in these cases. And I think we're talking to people who have an audience here on the podcast and in the room here. And I think that part of this is about that, like, this is the time to shape where things are happening, because I don't think it's automatic. I think that we can reinvent the book or decide, actually push back and say, no, it's important to keep a narrative, but we have to do that in a way that's LLM aware rather than saying these systems don't do anything. They're plagiarism machines. I mean, only in the most abstract sense. They're not writing sentences someone else did and pasting them in. They're doing something very different. They're training the corpus of human writing. If you care about writing, you should care about these things. If you care about thinking, you should care about these things. But we really have to take an active role in shaping it. And that's what worries me the most, is sitting out that and just listening to someone pontificate about the future of writing. I mean, Sal Khan's smart and a great person. I don't know if he has any particular insight into what the future, like maybe people want to hear your brain even more. It's even more important to have Stephen Johnson filter this information to me than have the LLMs do it. We just don't know.
Yeah. Well, I love that message that we want this community of writers and thinkers to be active participants in shaping this future. With that in mind, we'd love to get questions from the group here. Feel free to raise your hand if you have a question or put a question in chat. John Borthwick, I think, has a question.
Oh, hey guys. Thanks very much. I'm really enjoying this. It's a great discussion. I was thinking, when I think about the sort of future of the book question, I was just thinking, like, early days of the internet, right? We talked a lot about like the future of media, future of films. Like, we tried to create these, like, multi-ends, sort of choose your own adventure to films. Turns out that a whole new business developed called gaming that sort of like eclipsed that and became that. Is the future of the book like something really different that we can't quite see today? A lot of the things we've talked about, which I think are fascinating, are like a few hops from what we think of being a book today. But could it be possible it's just going to be something completely different?
Or spin off other things, right? I mean, there's probably other ways of exploring the same sort of imaginary space where books are part of it, and books are, in ways that weren't before and out of other parts of the conversation. Another Google team has been released a new diffusion model that lets you walk through any three-dimensional space that you describe, right? So, what does that do? And people really want to walk through the book that they're reading. The idea of a notebook LM gathering of all of the sources for a particular novel, like, it's actually pretty trivial for me to say, gather the sources from this novel, put together a repository, let me then question what the book is about from those, have a counter argument. Is it become a living document? Does it become a voyage you travel through? Or does it become, like a lot of things, we have people still just want to read books, but now there's a ton of other categories of things that are not books, that are out there as well. I mean, whether books win this or not, right? Whether we're the category that owns knowledge or something else owns that category and books remain their niche topic that, that is persisted for thousands of years, I don't know the answer to that.
One other thing I'd add to that, Ethan, is so I did this experiment. I haven't really talked about this publicly. I'm going to write about it at some point, but I basically had this idea for a Michael Crichton style thriller that I'd been taking notes on in the background for a million years. I would never write this thing. Like, I'm not a fiction author, but I had a kind of a plot. And so about 6 months ago, I decided, what if I just gave up all my preciousness about did the AI write it or did I not write it? And just as an experiment, just co-authored it with Notebook, and now actually with the new tool we're working on inside of Labs. And I basically calculated how much time it took me to write it. I wrote about a 40,000 word novella in this thriller mode in 72 hours of writing. Just being here's the outline, here's my general ideas, write the next scene. And I'd be like, that's good, make it creepier. That's pretty good. Make it a little bit darker. Make it a little Stephen King okay, that's good. Let's go. Keep going. And it felt like, to your point that our shared interest in interactive games, it felt more like playing a game than writing. And as I was writing it, I was like, I think I'm just writing this for myself. I think it's just right. I want to know this story, and I don't actually have any ambition to share this, maybe with the world. I mean, who knows, I may change my mind, but it was so satisfying on my own. And I think about fan fiction in this way, where you're I'm not a writer, but boy, do I have this idea for vampires and Jane Austen that I want to combine, and I want to write that book. And co-authoring that with the AI, suddenly maybe the future of the book is just there's so many more people who write books actually, because they are unleashed in this way. So that's another optimistic one.
And just to add to that, my wife and I have both been generating kind of stories, and we find them very compelling. And we've been trying to figure out why, because if you look at GPT-5, she gave an amazing prompt of a short story about a museum guard who's an unreliable narrator and changes the text of the descriptions of paintings, right? And that's the narrative. And it was really good until you kind of read the whole thing. And it felt really good. And you're like, wow, this is incredible writing. And then you sort of break it down. You're like, actually, this part doesn't really make sense. It's just the writing style is so interesting that you're giving it credit for that it found something meaningful here, but it was only meaningful in our head, right? And there's the same kind of experience you were describing, Stephen, of I feel there is a little bit of the IKEA effect, where if you make something, you feel it's your own. I get a lot of satisfaction out of giving really hard, give me a give me a Regency romance in space with a murder mystery at its heart. And is it good? I don't know, right? But I enjoy reading it. I'm excited to read it when it comes out of the machine. Is that because, and I feel a sense of ownership or co-creation because I've never read a Regency romance murder mystery set in space before, where relativistic delays mattered. And does it matter that it's amazing? I have difficulty kind of grappling with that. And I think that new form of creation, word synthesizer, is something that people played with a lot, right? And Exquisite Corpse and all these kind of games, but you never could create meaning out of it. So it was always, but the meaning is created in our head. It's a really interesting way of interacting with the written word.
Right. Ethan and I are both going to get great book deals for our fiction out of this. I can feel it.
Well, and Stephen, you also created a game out of one of your books, right? That was an ability to have a kind of role. So the role playing experience can be that of both the author and the reader potentially, right?
You can throw anything. I did this in Notebook. You can throw in a Wikipedia entry for the Cuban Missile Crisis and just do a custom chat prompt and say I want to play the Cuban Missile Crisis where I'm JFK. I have 10 turns in the conversation to avoid nuclear war. And Notebook will just do it out of the gate. It'll just turn into this, and all the other models will do this as well. So I did it with my book Infernal Machine, and it's a pretty interesting, it's a great, Ethan knows way more about this than I do, but it's a great way to learn, to play the history. So that's another whole side of it.
It's a great part of the revolution in education, which Ethan, you're engaged in.
Yeah, we've been doing a lot of simulations with AI that work really well. It plays different characters with you, it gives you feedback. I also saw some super interesting, Benjamin Breen, who's a historian at I think UC Santa Cruz, has created a Black Death simulator where all the students go through that. And and again, as the models get smarter, it used to be that you had to write very elaborate text to do this. Now you throw in a book and say, let's turn this into a challenging game. Make sure there's you can write a couple paragraphs of description. The thing I'd really leave is that this is the moment for writers, right? You can do some pretty amazing stuff pretty easily here. in that perspective. So, like you writing and giving instructions and teaching, like that's what these systems do best with. So I'm really excited, but I really would urge people to just do stuff, right? It's like the barrier to do stuff is dropped, and you will find some stuff that disturbs you, stuff that excites you. I mean, I really love the methods Stephen and I had here that we took approaches. I think a lot of that comes through.
So, Stephen, you'd said that you weren't sure if we're going to call it writing or more like conducting an orchestra, like the process of writing in a partnership, in what Ethan would describe as a cyborg, partnership with AI as a co-intelligence. And I look forward to, however we end up writing books, I look forward to the symphonies that you two conduct, whether you do it all yourself or with in an entanglement with various future AIs. Thank you both.
Thank you. Great seeing you, Ethan. Super fun. Good
Wonderful, folks. Thank you all for joining. I wish we had more time, but next time. And that's our show. As I mentioned, this conversation first appeared on Author Insider, our new community and learning platform for writers. To subscribe, follow the link in the episode notes. You'll find there links to some of our favorite conversations about the neuroscience of learning and the dawn of artificial intelligence. Today's show was produced by Caleb Bissinger and sound designed by Mike Toda. I'm Rufus Griscom. See you next week.